Good morning, friends. We have Dr. Adrienne Dengerink Chaplin speaking with us today from London. Really excited about it. And Paula Saxenmeier is here to introduce Dr. Chaplin. Paula is one of the facilitators of the Boston Fellows Arts Cohort. Paula, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Boston Fellows, and good afternoon, Dr. Chaplin. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning. I'm honored to introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Chaplin, who is joining us via Zoom from her home in Cambridge in the UK. Dr. Chaplin is currently a research fellow at King's College in London, following a notable career focused on the interface of philosophical and theological aesthetics, with a particular interest in art and meaning, and socially engaged art and peacemaking. Originally from the Netherlands, Dr. Chaplin studied art history, violin, and philosophy, gaining her doctorate at the University of Amsterdam. She taught at the Institute for Christian Studies at the University of Toronto, and while there served as president of the Canadian Society for Aesthetics. Also, she has taught at Regent College in Vancouver and has over the years given many public lectures for Christian organizations like Redeemer's Center for Faith and Work in New York City. Dr. Chaplin has authored many articles and books, including the co-authoring of Art and Soul Signposts for Christians in the Arts. As well, she is founding curator of the traveling exhibition Art, Conflict, and Remembering, which features non-sectarian murals created by artists depicting the experience of local people living through the Troubles, the violent 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland. Today, Dr. Chaplin will be inviting us to consider art in a time of crisis. Reflecting on the relevancy of poetry in the early years of World War II, T.S. Eliot wrote to a friend, "In the midst of what is going on now, it is hard when you sit down at a desk to feel confident that morning after morning spent fiddling with words and rhythms is a justified activity." In a year of many global crises, the pandemic, economic hardship, environmental concerns, oppressive dictatorships, some of us may ask ourselves the same question as Eliot. What good are the arts in times of crisis? Are we not merely rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chaplin to Boston Fellows.
Thank you so much, Paula. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you all online here today. And I would like to thank the Boston Fellows, and in particular, Kelly Madden and Paula Saxenmeier for that kind invitation. I'm joining you here indeed from the UK at 3 p.m. in the afternoon with the sun shining on and off through the curtains. So we'll see how that goes with the light. I'm particularly pleased to join you, as what you are doing in Boston Fellows program is very close to my heart, to bring together faith and professions and worship and work. I come from a Reformed tradition in the Netherlands, which has been inspired by Abraham Kuyper, who took this all very seriously when he tried to extend the Lordship of Christ to every corner of society and scholarship, whether science, business, healthcare, law, or, as our topic of today, the arts. There is a lovely passage in Isaiah where the prophet says, "Seek ye the welfare of the city, where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." Now, it is spoken to the Israelites in exile and in a time of crisis, but in a deeper sense, this applies to all believers. Wherever we happen to be and wherever we work, we are called to promote the welfare of the city and, in a broader sense, I believe, the culture around us, even in this time of a global pandemic. I can only assume that most of you will have been affected by COVID-19 in some way or the other. If you have not caught it yourself, you may know someone who did, or may not even have survived. Many people, in addition, felt socially isolated or trapped in situations that in turn created fear and anxiety. And in those situations, many have also turned to the arts, whether books, films, or music, that might either have diverted them from their daily anxieties and boredom, or alternatively help them to place their predicament in a larger context so as to make some sense of it. So with that in mind, let us turn to the topic of today, art in a time of crisis. And I'm going to share my screen now. And I just want to check if that is working. Can you all see the image there? Great. Well, let me then start with the quote from the poet, which Paula already mentioned, T.S. Eliot. In the early years of the Second World War, he wrote to a friend, in the midst of what is going on now, it is hard when you sit down at your desk to feel confident that morning after morning spent fiddling with words and rhythms is a justified activity, especially as there is never any certainty that the whole thing won't have to be scrapped, he says after that. Now, what he referred to as his fiddling with words and rhythms was to turn into the last three poems of his famous four quartets, all written during the relentless 57-day-long air raids on London by the German Luftwaffe between September 1940 and May 1941, better known as the Blitz. So during those years, Eliot spent half his week in Surrey and half in London, where he worked for the publishing house Faber and Faber. Overnight, he would either stay in a hotel or with the Fabers themselves in their bomb-proof basement. So he would definitely have seen the worst of the destruction and the devastation caused by the bombs. So it is perhaps understandable that Eliot begins to doubt his occupation and vocation, his fiddling with words and rhythms. Even so, he may not have been aware that just as in our time of the pandemic, then too, people were hungry for books and poetry as for any other forms of art. This is clear from a comment made by the writer and campaigner Beatrice Ward, who observed, England was experiencing a book famine. At least 20 million books had been destroyed in the burning of libraries and publishing houses. The works of Janet Bernard Shaw were now out of print. Yet, so she wrote, the people are turning to reading as they never did before for escape from war strains. So Ward drew attention to the fact that the destruction of books was a key component of attacking a culture as a whole. In Germany in the 1930s, book burning was a way to cleanse German culture from unwanted, mainly Jewish voices and influences. And these books included not only political works, but novels and plays by Stefan Zweig, Heinrich Mann, Franz Kafka, Bertolt Brecht, Heinrich Heine, Victor Hugo, and many more. And many may have recalled Heine's words from his tragedy Almansor, where he writes, "This is just a prelude. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn men as well." And how right he was. Books are dangerous because they contain stories that allow people to entertain new ideas and envisage other worlds. It enables them to think imaginatively and empathetically into the lives of others and understand that despite the vast gaps between people in times, places and circumstances, we all share the same humanity, have the same fears, have the same longings. Now, this can be a very liberating feeling, as it not only lifts us temporarily out of our current predicaments, but it places them in the context of a larger narrative, a larger redemptive story that reminds us what it means to be human and be created in the same image of God. Now, interestingly, in his poem, The Four Quartets, Eliot hardly refers to the concrete horrors of war, at least not directly. Instead, it addresses these larger, more universal themes while working with musical analogies of themes and variations, tempos and moods. And in that sense, he was a typically modern poet, deeply confirmed with form and style. We may say, he said, that the duty of the poet, as poet, is only indirectly to his people. His direct duty is to his language, first to preserve and second to extend and improve. Now, these days, contemporary poets and artists feel less concerned about dealing directly with the major, with forms and rhythms and so, and are more concerned with the major issues of their time: climate change, war, refugees, poverty, gender and race, and so on. And some art explicitly condemns acts of war by means of graphic showings, its horrors and its violence to humanity. And such art can be meant to serve as an explicit deterrence. Now, there are many earlier examples of that in the history of art, and very well-known example would be Goya's The 3rd of May, which he painted to commemorate Spanish resistance to Napoleon's armies during the occupation of 1808. So there's no holding back here about the horrors of the execution of resistance fighters, their blood visibly flowing as they fall to the ground. 100 years later, the German artist Max Beckmann painted his harrowing image of a civilian family being raped and tortured during World War I. It's called The Night. Beckmann had joined the German army as a volunteer for the medical corps in 1914, but the horrors of the war he had witnessed completely changed his perspective of the world and led to a loss of his trust in mankind. After suffering a mental breakdown, he started painting again, through which he processed his traumatic memories. Most famously, of course, is Picasso's Guernica. This painting was created in response to the bombing of Guernica in that same year, 1937, during the Spanish Civil War. And it was the bastion town Guernica that was the center of Republican resistance against General Franco and seen as an important target. Now, sometimes activist art or protest art uses not the horrors as a deterrent, but uses humor or irony to make its point and expose the foolishness of war and militarism. And a well-known example of this kind of art are the guerrilla murals painted by the British artist Banksy, such as these done between 2005 and 2007 on the separation wall in Bethlehem on the West Bank. This one, The Flower Thrower, shows a masked Palestinian throwing what might have been a hand grenade or Molotov cocktail over the wall, but instead his hands hold a bouquet of flowers, a symbol, a universal symbol of love and peace. A similar device is employed here. Again, with a twist, Banksy uses the symbol of the peace dove, but a peace dove with a bulletproof vest and a practice shooting target on its chest. In fact, the wall of this mural still contains the bullet holes of the first Intifada. Just one final example of this kind of art is Gul frisking an Israeli soldier. And again, it exposes the dehumanizing effect of random frisking and the surreal inversion of the roles. So although a genuine political activist, many of Banksy's murals are now mass-produced and reproduced and can be found on greeting cards, posters, and other merchandise. Yes, there is also other art again that is made in times of conflict or post-conflict, which seeks to point to possibilities of reconciliation and peace between previously hostile communities. Such art often uses conventional symbolisms that represent the coming together of or stand for reconciliation, such as people or hands reaching out to each other. And here are some examples. So the first one is Cassie Latham, Over Time We Come Together, and she's from an Aboriginal indigenous background in Australia. Another example of hands reaching out is this statue called Hands Across the Divide by Heron in Derry, Londonderry. This was made 6 years before the peace agreement. And note that the hands are not actually quite touching. So there's the hope and the expectation. Another very famous image is that of two people embracing in this famous sculpture called Reconciliation by Josephine at the Fascicle Chalice in the ruins of the Coventry Cathedral, which in itself is known as the Cathedral of Reconciliation after it was bombed during the Second World War. Now, replicas of this statue can be found in many places in the world, including Berlin, Hiroshima, and also in Belfast, as in this photo. Now, art like this can be very moving, but it also raises some questions. In Belfast, for example, where this sculpture stands in the park-like grounds of Stormont, which is the home of the government, the sculpture does not represent the reality of lived experience of people on the streets. While outsiders and tourists may be touched and moved by the embrace, for those on the ground it may be experienced as patronizing and prescriptive, as not understanding the real ongoing hurts and traumas, while at the same time being told to shake hands or hug to make up. In a situation such as Northern Ireland, which is officially in peace but not post-conflict and still deeply segregated, such art is rarely effective. And I will come back to Northern Ireland later and show some alternatives. Just to finish this section of art in crisis, let me show you one more example of a very different kind of art that engages imaginatively and creatively with violent conflict. This is the project Swords into Plowshares that was initiated by the Christian Council of Mozambique in 1995. The title of the project, of course, refers to Isaiah 2, verse 4, which talks about how people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks when Christ returns to judge the nations. Now, the project consists of a scheme that enabled the exchange of weapons in return for tools and other devices such as bicycles and sewing machines. In 1992, after a bloody 50-year-long civil war in Mozambique, in which over 500,000 people were being killed, all fighting parties had been ordered to surrender their weapons. At the same time, it was widely known that many had held onto them in case there might be another conflict, another war. As a result, the project's attractive offer of exchange, as a result of that, an estimated 600,000 weapons were handed in. So they had all been hiding somewhere in people's houses. But the genius of the project is this: once the weapons were handed over, they were dismantled, broken down in small parts, which were then offered to local artists to be used in materials for sculptures or other creative uses. So here's some examples of what they made with it. So here's a very simple example of an elephant or a dog. But others were even more complex and ambitious, such as this chair, which was made entirely out of rifles. It was made by an artist called Christopher Canvato, better known as Kester. Here on two other chairs he made out of weapons. So here he is. And we go back to the throne. Now, the throne is mainly made out of Russian AK-47 assault rifles, which had been manufactured in Portugal, Eastern Europe, and North Korea. The rifles that make up the backrest were designed in Germany and manufactured in Portugal. And all of them were widely used throughout West Africa, including Mozambique's war for independence from Portugal itself that they gained in 1975. The chair was purchased by the British Museum and made it onto the radio program, The History of the World in 100 Objects, by the director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor. Having looked at a couple of examples of art made in times of crisis, it is clear that despite obvious major differences between a Guernica by Picasso and a stenciled mural by Banksy, they all have a direct engagement with the predicaments of their own times and situations. What's interesting though, as I hinted earlier, this has also become a predominant feature of much contemporary art. No longer purely concerned with the formal features and composition of a work, much contemporary art is subject-driven and dealing with the issues that occupy us in the here and now. In addition, a growing dissatisfaction with an out-of-touch, elite and market-driven art world has led many artists to rethink their practices and purposes. And some of them have turned to what is often termed socially engaged art, also known as interventionist art or participatory art or new genre public art. This latter term, new genre public art, was coined by Susana Lacy in the collection of essays she edited under the title Mapping the Terrain, New Genre Public Art in 1994. And on this edition, she has a very interesting quote from a writer activist, Estela Condil Bajoso. Majosa says, to search for the good and make it better, this is the real challenge for the artist. Not simply to transform ideas or revelation into matter, but to make those revelations actually matter. So unlike traditional forms of art, which are typically produced by one individual artist for passive aesthetic contemplation, socially engaged art tends to involve high levels of collaboration with others in its process of production, from its initial inchoate inception to its final production and presentation. One of the first pieces of such socially engaged art was the project The Crystal Quilt, created by Susana in 1985. For this project, she recruited over 400 women over the age of 60 to share their personal views of what it meant to grow older. The work took 3 years to prepare and involved numerous interviews and recordings of women's life stories that highlighted the changing status of older women in society. It resulted in a live performance in a public space, which you can see here on the image. And the performance was filmed, and the piece now exists in the form of a documentary film together with the audio interviews and pieces of the quilt itself. You could say that in many ways, socially engaged art was felt to be a welcome and refreshing counterpart to the often rarefied world of contemporary art and its market-driven, celebrity-hungry culture. It aimed to connect art with real-life issues that are relevant for ordinary people. At the same time, however, some critics were concerned that too much focus on topical issues might risk making art too politically driven or, more generally, too message-oriented, thereby losing some of its elusive and evocative qualities. Now, this concern reminds us of the debates in Marxist and neo-Marxist circles in the 1930s between, on the one hand, Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertolt Brecht, and on the other, Theodor Adorno and Marcuse. You could say that while all of them agreed that art had to be politically relevant and socially transformative, they differed on the question how art could do that best. So for Brecht and Sartre, art could only be seriously committed by serving a particular political agenda in the struggle for a better society. For Adorno and Marcuse, on the other hand, art could only be really socially relevant when it was able to retain its autonomy from a political agenda, and that would be a precondition for proper artistic integrity and truth. As Marcuse wrote in his book The Aesthetic Dimension, art cannot change the world, but it can contribute to changing the consciousness and drives of the men and women who could change the world. Now, ironically, it also reminds us a little bit of the debates in Christian circles about whether Christian art should be serving a direct and overtly evangelistic purpose, or whether it should rather be more oblique and about art that expressed a Christian worldview so that it could implicitly change the consciousness of men and women. And this question was addressed by the late art historian Hans Rookmaaker in his booklet, Art Needs No Justification. So, as he argues in there, Christian art is not about making evangelistic tracts or biblical illustrations, but about art that represents life in all its rich variety from a perspective that is shaped by a Christian worldview. Let me now, for my final example of socially engaged art, return to Northern Ireland and show some art that was made outside the walls of the museums, outside the gallery world of art and galleries, but on the streets by three muralists in Derry, London, Derry, and Paula already referred to that. So here they are, the three bauxite artists, Kevin Hassan, William Kelly, and Tom Kelly. These three men painted 12 murals along a main street in the bauxite neighborhood that was at the center of the Troubles, a 30-year violent conflict between Protestants, Catholics, and the British Army that started with the Civil Rights March in 1968 and ended with the peace agreement in 1998. Now, the bauxite in Derry was at the epicenter of the conflict, including many of the marches, but also the day of Bloody Sunday, in which 13 unarmed civilians were killed and that shook their community to the core. And this is remembered on one of their murals called Bloody Sunday. And the mural was painted on the very street where the killings took place, and like the Banksy mural, still has the bullet holes of that time, of that day in the wall. Now, the image is based on two famous photographs, one showing a local priest, Father Daly, with a white handkerchief leading a group of men carrying the lifeless body of Jackie Duddy, one of the protesters on the march, who would later die of his wounds. The other photo is of the same group, but taken from a different angle, this time with the soldiers in view. So the mural, as you can now see, is a combination of those two previous photographs. It is a kind of artistic rendering of those two angles of the event. Now, unlike Banksy, who is really an outsider to the struggle of the Palestinians, the bauxite artists experienced their struggle firsthand. This is their civil rights mural. Their art is more personal in that it represents people from the community they grew up in and knew very well. That applies to this mural. They would know all the people whose faces are depicted on this mural. And these marches were modeled on those in the United States led by Martin Luther King. Or this one of a young boy who happens to be the 14-year-old cousin of two of the artists. Again, the mural is based on a famous photograph by the British press photographer Clive Limpkin, taken during the Battle of the Bauxite in August 1969. And here you can see Clive Limpkin himself, the photographer who took the photo, talking to police on that day, who was also wearing gas mask against the tear gas they were spreading themselves. Now, this mural is often seen to represent some paramilitary fighter. And this association is enforced by the media, as when it was used as a backdrop for the photo of the funeral of Martin McGuinness, thereby suggesting a link between the mural and McGuinness' paramilitary past. But a closer look, however, shows a different picture. Here is another photo of the boy without a mask, as it appeared on the front cover of Paris Match that same month, shot by French photojournalist Gilles Carreau. The gas mask the boy is wearing is in fact an old and defunct Second World War exemplar that gives no protection whatsoever and is just worn for the coolness factor. So here's another one which reveals that this boy was not really a hardened paramilitary fighter, but just a kid fooling around, even while playing with dangerous missiles. And the flat in the background where you can see are the walls on which the murals are currently being painted and being seen. So it's the very street. And here are the artists again with their cousin. So years later, after the peace agreement, and the boy is now wearing again a striped shirt, so you can see how he is the same. Now, what's the point I'm trying to make here? One is, do not judge or dismiss an image or art without giving it a closer look. There is often a story behind them, even if it may be ambiguous, as in this case. In this case, of Paddy Coyle, the boy bomber, for instance, I can see him in two different lights. On the one hand, he is the violent aggressor, throwing a lethal bomb, but he is also a vulnerable victim whose mask is supposed to protect him from the tear gas and brutality of the police and the British Army, but is of no use at all. But the mural also raises some questions. What does a boy that age do with a petrol bomb that can cause such lethal damage? Who sanctioned and encouraged an entire community to produce these dangerous missiles? And what desperate times and circumstances can drive sensible families to put themselves and their children at such risk? Look for example at this photo of whole families preparing petrol bombs. It looks like a street party with craft activities, but they're actually making Molotov cocktails. Now, what should be understood is that unlike most murals in Northern Ireland, the murals of the bauxite artists are not sectarian, such as these Republican murals. Although the bauxite murals are about the conflict and therefore obviously political, they do not carry threats or slogans promoting a Republican cause. These murals express what people lived through on a daily basis, such as this standoff between a local youth and the British Army. There are no raised rifles, flags, or symbols linking them to any paramilitary or political organization. There are no shamrocks or harps or Gaelic writings appealing to Irish history, mythology, or national identity. They do not romanticize historical heroes or some distant mythological past. Most importantly, they do not glorify violence. Instead, you could say, these murals are commemorative laments and a critique of violence from whatever side. The murals serve as safe spaces and talking points for local people to process painful memories. The bauxite artists often quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the first chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Committee in 1996. Tutu once said, "A conflict is like a wound. A wound must be cleaned out and examined before it will heal. It is the unexamined wound that festers and eventually poisons." So their murals, the bauxite artists would say, they show the wounds. Now, it may be a long jump from the bauxite artist back to T.S. Eliot, but there is something they both get. Art is always about the way people feel and what they live through. Earlier on, I showed a quote by Eliot writing about the duty of the poet to language, to preserve and extend it. But when we look at what he said after that, we can understand what he meant. So he said, we may say that the duty of the poet as poet is only indirectly to his people. His direct duty is to his language, first to preserve and second to extend and improve. What follows is also interesting. He says, in expressing what other people feel, he is also changing the feeling by making it more conscious. He is making people more aware of what they feel already and therefore teaching them something about themselves. And he can make his readers share consciously in new feelings which they had not experienced before. Now, to express what people feel presupposes a sensitive eye and ear attuned to subtle nuances. And that, of course, is the prerogative of the artist. That's his medium, his métier. It is not an easy task, especially not in a time of crisis or conflict. As peace activist and mediator John Lederach wrote, "To speak well and to listen carefully is no easy task at times of high emotions and deep conflict. People's very identity is under threat." And that is where art can come in, whether in times of crisis or in so-called normal times. Because art is eminently capable of looking and listening carefully. of sensing and feeling the nuances and gradation of shades that go often unnoticed in the functionality of daily life, or remain under the radar screen of rational consciousness. And in doing so, art can nurture the capacity for human empathy and compassion, or what Eliot calls the moral imagination. So just to finish, whether in times of crisis or in times of stability, I like to think that it is this moral imagination that lies at the heart of what makes us human, and is also the foundation of all good art as intended by God. And I will stop here. So thank you for your attention, and I will stop screening.
Wow, that's remarkable. Thanks so much for that. That's there's so many things that we could talk about, and we've only got a limited amount of time here. As I was listening to you, Dr. Chaplin, talk about the work of the artist, I thought of Dorothy Sayers' famous saying, "Serve the work." That in one sense, the first duty of anyone working anywhere is to do well what they do. Is that an accurate analogy or application to this particular to art, the commitment to serve first of all the work of art rather than the community at large, or the political interests that are current?
I think that's right. And in that sense, T.S. Eliot is also correct. Unless the art has the proper nuance, or the proper attention to the different shades, to imagination, to all those things, to affective experience, it becomes a message board for something, which you might as well say in another way. It is indeed that working in a medium which requires a lot of skill and a lot of talent, and it only works at that level, because otherwise it's closing down rather than opening up. So art, in a way, makes space for thinking otherwise, you could say. It presents something for reflection. It says, suppose that it has happened. Let's think differently otherwise. Yeah, so in that sense, the fact that the artists practice their scales and practice their rhythms and rhymes and all those tedious things, it's only because of that work put in that the work is actually able to create that space.
Another thing that leapt to mind as you were finishing up is that the first task of the artist is actually not to express, but to listen, to study, to observe, to watch. I mean, that stood out to me, and that's counterintuitive. I'm speaking, of course, as a non-professional, as a non-vocational artist. But what more could you say about that?
The first task is, I think, of an artist is to look well. It's an exercise in proper perception, and also to teach us to look well. So through art, we see the world differently, obviously. So it is an exercise in looking and listening and seeing, perhaps even smelling and tasting and touching. It's just a more conscious attention to what we otherwise see in a very functional way.
We should probably step back for just a moment and say, what is art for our purposes here today? Is it any artifact, broadly speaking? Is it work with a purpose apart? We were looking at a very broad range of of artistic work today. But what do we understand? What is art?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm glad you start with a simple question, Callie. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So, in a way, you're right. I think any object could be art, and of course, there's a whole modern a movement of found objects, which takes objects from the street, put them in the gallery, and then presents them for presentation. So context is very important, and it can, in principle, be any artifact. So it all depends on the way it is being looked at, and whether it can present it in such a way that it becomes symbolic of or evocative of something or suggestive of something. And that's often through associations and the way it is being presented. So in principle, I would say, yes, any artifact could become art. It's all how it is being used.
Okay, I hope we have time to come back to that, because a lot of us who are not vocational artists want to know, how we can express something of artistic value in the work that's not that we have. But maybe it might be, at this point, it might be better if I dig down a little bit more and ask, what you're saying. What I think I understand is that art communicates something to us, but it's not in propositions. Flannery O'Connor, somebody asked her about the meaning of one of her stories, and she just refused to answer, saying that if I could have said it in propositions, I wouldn't have written the story. So it's a mistake in some ways to try to put too much of a message. But then how does it communicate if it's not to us in propositions? You mentioned feelings and a way of communicating how we live. What more can you say about how does art communicate with us, if not through statements as such?
Yeah, you're quite right about Flannery O'Connor, and there's stories about Beethoven as well, who played a piece, and lady from the audience comes to him and says, "Oh, what do you mean with that?" And he just sat back at the piano and played the piece again. He said, "That's exactly what I mean." So this all has to do with how art communicates and means. Now, if you compare it with language, you could say art is never declarative or assertive or commanding something or ordering something. It's always questioning and exploratory. So you often have this phrase. I mean, to nauseate, to be honest, but the work questions so and so. That's often what the pieces around art say. But that's exactly what it does, as it were. So the mode of art is not this is so and so, but suppose that this is so and so, or imagine that it would be so and so, or consider this for a moment that it might. So it puts options in front of us. It renders certain experiences available to our consciousness. So it does not necessarily make a statement about it, that it is right or wrong. It says, this is a way of looking at the world. Now what? It opens up, it should open up conversation rather than closing it down. And that in itself is a very important task, because there are so many feelings or unspoken moods or nuances which otherwise do go unnoticed. So that goes back to our earlier point. And so the artist teaches us to notice and to and that might be, say, a very obvious thing, shades or of light in the garden, so the perceptions of that, or our deeper feelings of, say, alienation or dislocation, or so things to do with the existential questions of the human condition. It has that whole spectrum, so it doesn't all have to be serious and deep. It can be playful, but it is just bringing something out which would otherwise not be observed or yeah, noticed. I think that is an important function of art.
There's a
And come to it with an open mind as well, rather than a prejudice. So yeah.
there's an implication there, I think, that implicitly you're saying that there is also has to be a learning to speak the language. The observer has to be educated to be able to understand, and the artist has to know the audience. One of the questions that's just come up in chat: some modern art is so buried and hidden or complicated meaning that the viewer can feel lost, and the art arguably risks making itself meaningless and ultimately extinct. So how could you comment on how to avoid that kind of a situation?
Yeah, some art does need a bit of background information. I mean, when we're going to look at Ai Weiwei, clearly, I mean, if we see that word cold,
Yeah,
it wouldn't make all that much sense. I mean, I enjoy the formal qualities, but so I mean, artist statements have a role. They can be very jargon rich, but a good artist statement says something, and which connects the artist with the audience. I mean, in pre-modern times, you usually would know the artist, that it would be a local figure. You wouldn't need to ask those questions. But now with our international global art world, there is often value in just making that connection with the artist and some of the experiences which led to the work and which open it up. So I'm not against artist statement. I don't necessarily say every work of contemporary art needs to be understood immediately as it is. Or you might understand it at one level, but not really get too much out of it in terms of deeper meanings. And I totally agree. A lot of contemporary art can be very esoteric and too esoteric. I mean, where you feel, yeah, you're so lost that you might as well give up, or you don't want to spend the whole day searching for the meaning.
As Christians, we have tremendous one source of art is in the Bible, and so someone asked, can you speak about the role of music in times of crisis? Music, there are examples in the Bible of music leading to rejoicing, to lament. In the contemporary era, we often see music in crisis around rebellion and uprising. Two recent examples that come to mind are the use of La Bamba and Do You Hear the People Sing from Les Miserables. So yeah, music specifically in time of crisis.
Well, the person who asked it, in a way, gave the answers themselves already. I mean, the lament and protest, and yes, there would be many examples, and I would love to hear more from the person who asked the question, or more. But I think the same principles apply to music as to visual art or to literature. Yeah.
There was a time, I mean, this is another one of these really simple questions for you. There was a time when almost all art that was seen by a larger audience was commissioned art, was paid for by individual patrons. It was all, in a sense, therefore, commercial art. What can we say about the corrupting influence of money, whether it's from a patron with a particular agenda, or even for that matter, from a government with a particular agenda, or people that are running a government-sponsored program with a particular agenda? How does the artist maintain integrity with the pressure of monetary concerns?
Yeah, that's a real tricky one. Artists have to live, and so they need commissions, and so it's a fine balance between keeping your independence and integrity and the sponsor. Now, it's often couched in negative terms. I think there's also very positive elements to having sponsor for a particular purpose. We're too much, I think. Having the model of art should be autonomous and just in the gallery. I think there should be more engagement with with daily life and commissions. A good example would be someone who makes, say, tombstones and has a relationship with the bereaved family and negotiates what they want. Architects, of course, always talk to their clients, so there is something very, very healthy about it as well. I mean, the problem starts when you feel that you're pushed into a direction where you feel you're losing your soul or your integrity, there's no standard answer to that, I think.
We want the final answer today. Maybe I will jump back to the question I asked earlier, because so many of us here today don't think of ourselves as artists vocationally. Is there a way, as we continue, we're going to move in just a moment to some other things, but as we think about engaging with art, those of us who are not formally artists, rather than just appreciating or consuming art, is there also a way for us to engage in art other than, say, I don't know, picking up painting, learning how to paint? How does the layperson engage with art sort of actively in that way? Yeah.
Yeah, obviously not everybody is a professional artist, but everybody lives within a world which has an aesthetic dimension, you could say, and people's life always have an aesthetic dimension, from arranging your living room or choosing the colors of how you dress, but how you do your garden, but also things like storytelling or nursery rhymes or everything, or telling jokes would be one, or playing a practical joke. That is an aesthetic act to some extent, in enhancing life and making it more playful, and again thinking outside the box, and not having everything in a functionality of day to day. So there are many ways in which we live aesthetically, which we might actually not be aware of. We're probably more aesthetically active than most people give credit for. So let it be an encouragement to
I just
people.
bought another pair of eyeglasses, and I was astounded by how many options there are out there. Every consumer choice, in a sense, can be that. We're going to move now to breakout sessions, and you've provided us with some questions. Nathan, if you wouldn't mind posting in this chat those questions, and then we'll also try to post them in the individual breakout rooms. But if there's a glitch, it'd be good for everyone to sort of copy those as well. We've put you all in groups that we're going to allow you to interact a little bit more personally on this time now for a few minutes. I think we've got something like 30 minutes of discussion, and we'll maybe pop in on you and see how things are moving before we come back together for our time together. But we will ask you all to report on your groups, and so if someone could take a few notes, and without being just the secretary, everyone should feel free to participate as well. But if someone would be willing to represent the group later on when we come back together, that would be a huge help for each of your groups. And but do listen to what everybody says. That's the tricky part. I find that I remember most what I say at a meeting. I don't remember so much what other people say. I remember my comments, and so work hard to listen to whatever other people are saying as well as we try to engage with this. And some of us will be popping in and out of your rooms to see how things are going. But Nathan, would you throw us out into our discussion groups now with the questions that have been offered? And I'll show you how that works. just like that. And that way we'll know that you're going to be reporting. We're not going to have each one report everything at once. So once we'll try to go through some of the questions individually and make it a little bit dynamic, back and forth. And if your reporter utterly fails to represent your comment adequately, you can jump in as well on the discussion. That's not likely to happen, but there are opportunities. Maybe something will occur to you that you wish you'd brought up, or whatever. We can talk about that this year. And so Nathan is going to be. I'll try to keep an eye on it as well, and he'll be spotlighting you, and I'll be working as well. So the first question we have is: during this past year of social isolation and lockdown, has there been a particular work of art, book, film, music, whatever, that's either given you a moment of distraction or comfort, or helped you contextualize your situation, make sense of it, and then give those examples? So let me see who we have here. I'm going to start with the person on my left, Barbara LaChance. So if you would unmute.
Kelly, you're muted.
Am I muted? I don't think
I can hear you,
so.
Kelly.
Yeah, I think maybe there's
Yep, we hear you.
Yeah, I think there's may have a glitch. Was that Elizabeth?
You're muted. I can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't hear me, Barbara? Well, Barbara, I think that maybe. Wow, I don't know. So if you can hear me, would you just wave your hand like this? Because I think there may be a problem.
Now I hear you.
Okay, all right. Barbara, you hear me okay now? Barbara, Barbara can't hear me. So Nathan, maybe you could work with her or somebody else. So while we're doing that, I'm gonna go to the next person. Connor, if you wouldn't mind reporting on that first question from your group. What do you what works were mentioned?
Well,
yeah.
Yeah. Michelle really enjoyed watching The Mandalorian in the last year. Baby Yoda was not mentioned, but I'm sure that was part of it.
Distraction, yeah.
Well, just, and also, like she mentioned, also just that it's not, it's an escape, but that escape kind of gives you a chance to step back from the frenzy and the just oppressive things that we're all facing, and to immerse yourself in stories. And it's just, this is my interpretation. It's people have been gathering around fires to tell stories since there have been people. It's one of the things we do, and I think we need that.
Yeah, storytelling, terrific. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give another example, Connor, and then we'll go to Eric.
Well, we weren't the most focused group. We expanded a lot. So I mentioned that my wife and I are reading Lord of the Rings right now, which has been absolutely fantastic in combination with a Lenten fast from news. So our hearts are just being expanded by story, delving into this favorite story of ours again after years. And others mentioned that they had Lucille mentioned that she had a cousin who did not have, who forbade having television or newspapers in his house, and so his children grew up being read to every night. Dickens,
Best possible way to teach reading is to read to kids. Eric, what did your group have? Unmute yourself. There you go.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So yeah, our group, we captured a few things. One was actually the creativity that's come through technology. And so for Chris and our group, there was just capturing a screenshot of a Zoom conference that initially felt like it was going to be daunting or like not going to be a success. and ended up flourishing and really working out well. And so that picture has become a piece of art for each person to like look back on. And
Green grab of a Zoom call. Wow, as inspirational. That's counterintuitive, to say the least, for me.
Yeah. And so also music. So Chris had mentioned Corey Wong, a punk guitar musician who's put out 12 albums during the pandemic. There was a wailing piece that Jess had mentioned that was a cross-functional or cross-distance collaboration. And then
great.
Abby had mentioned pandemic music, specifically country music.
Cool. Okay, Jared, unmute yourself. We'll come back to you, Eric, in just a minute.
Sure. Our group wasn't always the most focused either, but we mentioned a few things. One is a website called Art and Theology, which is sort of I wasn't familiar with, but Gloria mentioned this as a kind of way to experience both joy and grief during the pandemic, and also in relation to sort of the social movements, social justice movements like Black Lives Matter and all of these other things that are happening at the same time. And we just mentioned sort of other aspects too. Barbara mentioned the actual act of painting, sort of producing art during the pandemic, as being a kind of comfort and a way to sort of escape from and take solace from sort of the difficult time. And just doing puzzles, that some of us mentioned, just doing puzzles of pieces of art as a sort of meditative kind of practice to do.
Great. Isaac.
Sure. Our group, Andrew shared the film The Way as an art piece that explored the meaning of loss. Elizabeth mentioned singing, and especially the song A Time Will Come for Singing, that really uplifts her spirit. And John mentioned slowly reading the four quartets, reading Gertrude Schnackenberg, and enjoying Pietro Francesca's fresco, The History of the True Cross. And he and I both enjoy listening to Arvo Pärt.
To what? I didn't catch that one.
Arvo Pärt, he's an Estonian classical music composer who composed these pre-modern style music that have long, simple notes that seem like the music slows everything down and draw you in.
Okay. Terrific. Anybody actually wave your hand, and I don't think everybody's hand is still up. That if you were sharing, reporting back, please keep that raised hand so that I can more easily see you, because we're going to go back and forth on that. Anybody in reporting the groups? Elizabeth Bonnell, we haven't heard from you yet. Are you're reporting on one of the groups? Raise your hand in the function so that Nathan can see you and spotlight you, and then give a couple of the art examples that you had, if you could, please, Elizabeth.
And it asked if I could give you permission to record, and I wasn't sure if I did that. So.
Well, it's recording whether you give your permission or not. So go ahead. What were some of the pieces of art that your group talked about?
Yeah, so a lot of people had been watching things that they wouldn't consider, that like on Netflix and series and stuff as a distraction, which sounds like that's kind of common for folks. But in terms of more specifically art or even watching things to get closer to stuff that was closer to art is, you know, watching musicals and stories, this maybe reading stories about communities, and you know, trying to stay away from sort of violence on television, even if it means going to something somewhat cheesy like Hallmark, but that those kind of things would then have you know, a more warm and comforting.
I'm curious, is anybody else out there like me? Just I'd like a literal show of hands that have kind of like sort of avoided serious stuff almost altogether. I find myself, when it comes to watching videos, or art, I have almost avoid, when I say serious, that's not the right word, but sort of like drama or violence or anything like that. I don't know. I guess that's just me, but I just find myself looking for ways to boost my mood.
Yeah, that sounded like the
challenging
consensus.
times.
Yeah, in our group, that including music. I mean, a couple of people commented that always music has been really important to them, and knitting, which is an art form, is a good escape. And one thing that I brought up that I don't even know if this is really art, but one of the things that I've turned to very quickly and have maintained is comedic meme content, especially stuff that's sort of commentating on the social behavior in the pandemic. Has been something that I've been spending a lot of time consuming and creating. So I don't know if that's exactly art or not, but it's got to be funny. The serious stuff is like, I agree with you.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Anybody else want to talk about sorts of or genres of art that they've gone to, works of art that we haven't already discussed that have been particularly, any of you guys that are reporters that want to touch on something? Looked at the clock, and we do need to move on here. I haven't even gotten to some of the other questions, but let me ask the support of the arts during the pandemic. What did we hear from you on that? Jared, let me go to you, since you're you happen to be the upper leftmost person here. What did you guys talk about with respect to supporting the arts during the pandemic?
Sure. We talked sort of more generally about supporting the arts in times of crisis, and we all kind of agreed that this was an important thing to do. We also had a kind of interesting discussion about a kind of tension that comes up too, where you know, often in times of crisis, there's a new emphasis on our material needs. So like literally eating and drinking and being sort of physically safe and things like that. That can make it really difficult to prioritize something like the arts. And I think it sort of both, that's a tension, and also sort of draws into relief what the arts are doing. They're not sort of, the arts are not sort of things that are just sort of judged on their use value. They enable us to do things. They can create community. They can sort of open us up to other people in a time where that is especially difficult because we're so focused on ourselves.
Great. Let me jump back to Connor. Thoughts on supporting art in the pandemic, during the pandemic?
Yeah. Again, we kind of used our questions as springboards to talk about broader topics, which is what I meant earlier when I said we weren't focused. I didn't mean to insult us. We just had lots of interesting
creatively unfocused.
Yeah, exactly, to delve into. So and I don't know if this is happening to anybody else, but one thing I've noticed in the pandemic is I can't speak as well. I forget words. I've talked with a bunch of other people this has happened to. I'm not old, but it's just like, it's like being, I mean, I'm not that old, but like being locked down for a year, I'm starting to, it's like I couldn't remember the word for oil, the word oil and butcher block. I couldn't remember those two words. That's crazy.
I'm recovering for COVID. I thought that was my problem. You're saying it's caused by the pandemic.
It's just like language atrophy from being locked down. Anyway, so we agreed like provisionally that art should be supported during times of crisis. But you know, I was one of the things we talked about was who supports the arts. There's kind of this understanding that, you know, we should support the arts, but does that mean the National Endowment for the Arts? Does that mean government funding? Generally, art has been. I made the point that you know, Shakespeare was not supported by governments or even by patrons. He wrote for the public. He wrote to get people to his plays, and we remember him, and we don't remember his well-connected peers. And one of the problems with modern arts that we were discussing, the sort of insularity and obscurity, is it's not just that it's too obscure, it's that it's only modern artists only make art for each other. You know, they're not trying to reach a broader public. It's a very contained little discourse, and it's funded by big foundations. So it's internal to itself. Where does funding, you know, sometimes art is best when it's like Robert Frost. He wrote for people, and people bought his books, and that's how he got funded.
Yeah. I think let's turn to the last question here. What did you guys talk about with respect to compassion and art giving us empathy for other people in this, particularly in this time of pandemic?
My group really just focused on the idea of art helping people deal with loss and connecting people with shared loss. Yeah, that was the main theme. And I think I mentioned that good art can often do that more effectively than not good art.
Yeah. Eric, why don't you, what did you guys, on the same question, please?
Yeah, we just touched on it briefly, but we used examples of a YouTube channel called The Dodo, which takes animals and puts them in situations where we have empathy for them being like brought out of places of cruelty or things like that. The emphasis of how music can take a situation, such as in a movie or something, and really draw emotion into it. And then also to the point where just sometimes pictures or of reality can be almost to the point of wanting us to turn away because they're so real. They just they speak so deeply into our emotions.
Yeah, Paula, you raised your hand there. Are you reporting or commenting separately?
Actually, Lydia is the reporter for our group. She just hasn't. She's had difficulty getting her hand to stay up. If you could call on her, that would be great.
Okay, sure, Lydia. Sorry about that. I'm subject to the technical glitches of Zoom. So would you share some things from your group, or I'm gonna call on you to make an executive decision about what's most salient from your group.
Yeah, we talked about, particularly with the third question and this idea of empathy in art. In our group, we're mostly active artists in one or another. So we thought kind of about the cyclical nature of empathy in art, and that one of the main functions of art often is to, create empathy in the viewer for the subject, but also that, as creators, you have to have empathy for your subject and also for whoever's going to consume your art, right? You want to think sort of about all sides of it. Yeah, so it's one of our main points for the third one.
Great. Well, I think we've probably prevented you guys from sharing everything that you would like to share, but we do need to go on. I want to ask Dr. Chaplin now to introduce I think we're onto the next section of our time together, which is to consider one particular artist and his work, Ai Weiwei. Dr. Chaplin, please introduce us to that.
Yes, okay. Yeah, just two observations about the comment. Thank you all for sharing. One seems to be that the pandemic actually gave a lot of space all of a sudden and time for exploring art, and also art which may not necessarily have been on your radar screen previously. So I think it may have expanded your range of appreciation for different kinds of work. But secondly, it's kind of the irony that we've relied. Art is so accessible now online, and at the same time, artists are still so undervalued, and I think has brought out the attention how much we rely on art in times of crisis, and yet the support is still quite minimal. So I hope it also gives a renewed appreciation for the role of the artist in society and how much we have actually relied and valued their products and contributions. So we're moving on indeed to the art of Ai Weiwei. Now, just if you briefly would raise your hands if you, prior to this session, had heard of Ai Weiwei. I just have no idea in the States. Okay, so perhaps 50%, half. Okay, that's useful to know. Yeah, I mean, he is arguably China's most famous and politically outspoken artist. So we're going to look at a 15-minute clip in a minute, which gives some background to his work straight. And it is a case where it is extremely useful to know some of that background, and it would be hard to understand. Now, when you see the work in the gallery, it would have all that information and the videos and the boards next to it. Often his art is accompanied by some kind of video clip of how it was produced, and that is the process in his work is almost as important as the final product. So it is important to know that. But let me just very briefly give you a little bit of information for those who haven't heard of him. So he was born in Beijing in 1957, and his father was a well-known poet, Ai Qing, who became a victim of Mao's purge of the intellectual middle class during the Cultural Revolution, and was sent to a labor camp with his family when Ai Weiwei was only 1 year old. After labor camp, after 3 years, he was exiled to another part of China, where he and his family lived in absolute dire poverty. For many years, they actually basically lived in a hole in the ground and lived from foraging and other such means. And it was only upon Mao's death in 1976 that the family was able to return back to Beijing. And by that time, I was already 19 years old, so he had not had any traditional schooling or education until then. He enrolled briefly in the Film Academy in Beijing to study animation, and then 3 years later moved to the United States, where he studied English in Philadelphia and San Francisco. And then he moved to New York in 1981, where he studied art and mixed with the likes of Marcel Duchamp, Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, the poet Allen Ginsberg, so all the big modern artists of that time. And it's important to remember these connections as they, to some extent, explain his artistic style and some of the incongruities with mixing that with the traditional techniques he found in China. He returned to Beijing in 1993 on account of his father's health. And while there, he became more and more critical of the Chinese regime and more outspoken also in his views about human rights and free speech. And he started blogging, and that also made him increasingly on the radar screen of the authorities. Now, a key year is 2008, when he started his major investigation into the corruption and the cover-ups following the massive earthquake in the Sichuan province. Because following that earthquake, it had transpired that many school buildings had collapsed, mainly because of poor construction and violation of legal building codes. And as a result, many more school children had died than would otherwise have been the case. So I drove to that area to interview people about the death of the children, and spoke to the parents, and starting an proper investigation in the corruption, in the building corruption and the cover-up. So he started a blog called Citizens Investigation with the intention to record the names of all the children that had lost their lives in the earthquake. And that's also what you will see at the beginning of the clip we are going to show. 2 months later, that was closed down by the authorities, and he was beaten by the police when he was witnessing at the trial of a fellow investigator of the earthquake. As a result of those beatings, he actually developed serious migraines and was diagnosed with a brain hemorrhage that required an emergency brain surgery in September of that year in Munich. And despite being under constant surveillance, he continued his challenges to the regime and started tweeting from then on, spending actually a lot of his time and days exposing human rights violations. As a result of all that, he was placed under house arrest, and in 2011 he was arrested at Beijing Capital International Airport under the false charges of economic crimes and tax evasions. His studio was searched by 50 officers who removed all his computers and hard drives, and also detained his staff, and as well as his wife, Liu Qing. And some of his staff is still disappeared, has still not returned. After he was arrested, he spent 81 days in detention in a small cell under 24-hour watch of 2 young guards who stood next to him all the times. And it was only under huge international pressure that he was released and allowed to leave Beijing in 2012. And it was not until 2015 that he was given back his passport and was able to move outside the country. So he moved to Berlin in that year, where he lived for 3 years. But he was disillusioned with that country as well, and then he moved to the UK and has actually moved to Cambridge. So he has been spotted on the streets here, and I'm still hoping to bump into him someday. So I've been for a long time interested and intrigued by this artist, not least because of his amazing resilience and his untiring energy. But also a huge imagination in the way that he responds to these issues. So as regards his art, in many ways, I think he's almost a model of what it means to be a socially engaged art, who does not use his art as direct political propaganda or a message board. But let me just show you a couple of images to illustrate that. So we are going to share the screen again. And can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, all good. So we'll start the slideshow from the beginning. There we have him. So his other major work was called Sunflower Seeds, which was the title of the article which was for a reading. Between 2010 and October 2010 and May 2011, half of the huge ground floor of the London Tate's Modern was filled with approximately 100 million tiny porcelain sunflower seeds, which were all hand painted individually by local craftspeople in the Chinese city of Jingdezhen. And it had taken 1,600 people 2.5 years to manufacture and paint the seeds, which in itself provided employment to workers in those areas whose skills and traditions were no longer required, as they had been pushed out because of China's massive industrial production and their typical kind of notion of cheap mass production and the made in China idea. So you could say from a distance, this floor did not look much. It was a bit of a featureless, outstretched sea of uniform gray in an already fairly drab and gray environment of the Tate's huge turbine hall. But if you came close, you noticed that each tiny little seat and how it was carefully crafted and decorated. And then you started to ponder really on the symbolic meaning of the piece as a metaphor for Chinese society and the place of the individual in its overall order. So, I mean, much more can be said of it, but what I wanted to talk about briefly is now this piece, Straight, which we are going to see also in the film. That was made in response to the earthquake, which we mentioned early, in which over 5,300 school children were killed. Now, one of the striking aspects of that earthquake was that while many multi-story buildings, including government buildings, withstood the earthquake and remained intact, over 100 schools collapsed. And as subsequently became clear, the schools were built in violation with building standards, which were basically done in order to cut corners and increase profits for the developers. So here is one of those buildings. So after the earthquake, despite warnings from the authorities, Ai Weiwei's workers worked with many researchers to track down and document the names of all the 5,000 victims, or the students, and collecting information about their gender and their date of birth, their class and school and parents' names and address. And in addition, he recovered hundreds of rusty reinforced steel rods from the rubble. And he had them all straightened out again, and then laid them down on the floor in a flowing landscape, the waves more or less echoing the waves of the earthquake. So he's quite literally, you could say, righting wrongs, bending steel, bent steel straight again. And it is a homage to those who died, and as well as a critique of the political corruption. As a consequence of his critique, and it is, I just want to add one spin-off of this work. His blog was closed down, and he was arrested on the 3rd of April at the airport, which I mentioned, and detained for 81 days in a room with these 2 guards. Now, when he was released, he made another work on that detention, and that was called Sacred. And it is something he often does in response to his surveillance. So Sacred consists of 6 diorama-style boxes with a tableau of different moments of his detainment. And the letters Sacred stand for supper, accusers, cleansing, ritual, entropy, and doubt, which is basically the different activities that took place during the day. Now, each unit has a small opening similar to those found on a prison cell door, for which viewers may peer into the dioramas. And in each box, Ai Weiwei has positioned a realist model of himself with his captors, documenting painstaking moments of his captivity in detail, so including the lack of privacy he had and the degrading surveillance of all his intimate bodily functions. Now, finally, interestingly, we saw it at the Royal Academy, but this shows again how context makes a difference to the work. It was also shown in a church in Venice, which gave it, of course, a very different feel than the Royal Academy. which also indicates the growing permeability, you could say, between the institution of art and the institution of the church. So just the three final comments. First, you can see there's a strong emphasis on the process rather than the product. So the whole process of the repairs of the rebar is essential to the work, as is the faithfulness and the loyalty of the workers, as you will see in the film, even though they were not sure what it was all for. Secondly, you could say politically subversive and critical art does not have to sacrifice visual power and imagination. It doesn't have to be purely a message board. And third, I want to go back to a quote from Jean-Paul Lederach, who says, "The moral imagination has the capacity to imagine and generate constructive responses and initiatives that transcend and ultimately break the grips of those destructive patterns and cycles." So it's another example of the imaginative power of art like that. Okay, the film we are going to see is a 50-minute clip in which the first half contains excerpts from his investigative document, Little Girl's Cheeks, which is a much larger video. But these are excerpts from it. So.
经过两百多次这个手工的这种敲击，又恢复到了这次里刚出厂时期的一个状态，就是一个非常笔直的，而它的所有的能力，仅仅是回到它最原始的一个状态。最后我们看到的是一些类似于材料的堆放。 在钢筋制作过程呢，实际上是和很多比较大的这种工程有着相似性，就是说非常单调的重复性的劳动，有很多人来完成。那么很多工人甚至完全不知道这些钢筋是从哪里来，为什么要敲制，将来会做什么用。
Thank you, Isaac. You can unshare there. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to interact with Dr. Chaplin about that, but I'm going to make it an executive decision for 2 minutes here. Dr. Chaplin's article quotes Jan Martel saying that to engage with art, one must be still. So here's what I'd like us to do is to just take 2 minutes of silence and just reflect on that, what we've just seen in the art we've just seen. Friends, let's come back together again here. I ask you to stop your videos. If you could go ahead and turn on your videos unless you don't want to. Dr. Chaplin, how would you like to do this? Should we just entertain comments from people? What's the best way for us to proceed here?
Yes, I'd just be very interested to know how people respond to it. I personally find it a very moving piece. It challenges Western notions of efficiency, but also those of mass production in China and elsewhere. Yeah, seeing every time I have seen it in the academy, but when I see images of it or photographs, I find it profoundly moving myself. I'd be interested to know whether other people have the same response or not. Yeah.
So if you'd like to make a comment, please use the raise hand function, or if you would prefer just to articulate something and put it into chat now as well, maybe that would be a better way for you to express your ideas. Please, we'd love to hear from you now. Use the raise hand function or enter something in chat. Go ahead, Paula. Paula, go ahead and unmute yourself. I'm not sure I don't see your video either. And unmute, Paula. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
Hi. This past week, the arts cohort was discussing different aspects of how the Holy Spirit inspires artists with a view toward the new heaven and the new earth in Revelation. And one part of that we discussed was that the excessiveness that God has in mind when he restores life to the way it ought to be. It's not just forgiveness, but it's forgiveness of everything. And there's an exuberance and excessiveness about that. And something that struck me in watching this, this video was how excessive everything was. Like an incredible amount of rebar, an incredible amount of time to straighten it all out. The wealth, the time, the manpower. There was something he did in all of that activity that spoke to me of the kind of excessiveness that someday will rejuvenate our life on this planet to the way that God intended it to be.
Yeah, thank you. That's very perceptive observation. I'm seeing one comment in chat. Have the Chinese officials been taken to court, and who were guilty in this case, and what justice has happened as a result of highways working in regard to the Sichuan earthquake? And the answer is actually no, they haven't. So that may raise the question, well, but what good is it if there are no results? But I think this relates to Paula's observation that even though no justice has been delivered as a direct result, it was still important to raise that prophetic voice. And in a way, you do these things irrespective of the results. It's like artists wanting to be successful, and we're not called to be successful in a way. We're called to be faithful. And I felt there's something about Ai Weiwei where he's faithful to do the work of justice, irrespective of whether there are actually direct results. And that is something, well, which is very hard to do. And he seems unusually complacent. Well, that's not the word. Doesn't mind about it almost. He almost kind of. I think as Christians we have this perhaps this Calvinist work ethic, that something has to be a product coming out of it. And well, there is no direct result in that sense, other than the work itself. He raised a lot of conscience about I mean, he raised my conscience. I had no idea about the background of the earthquake, so I've learned a lot from it, and I'm sure thousands others will. And indirectly, you hope he is working on the consciousnesses of people who may then, but there is not a kind of direct causal effect of the art, and I think that relates to your comments about access, where you do something of which the results are not obvious, but it is faithful.
Eric.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment that, starting with that T.S. Eliot quote, and here just watching this video, realizing that really art has a critical role in revealing injustice and in being a part of tragedies and current events. And so this process, and I love really what Dr. Chaplin shared of like the process here is equally as important as the final outcome. And so just seeing both of them coming together and sharing a story, and the way that art is really just, to me, I'm just reflecting on other incidences in the past of art is a component and shouldn't be overlooked in terms of tragedies or current events, or exposing things that are unjust. So anyway, that was my observation.
Can I ask a question?
Go, Connor.
With the focus on art as sort of revealing injustices, I mean, I wonder how easy that is to sort of reconcile with the idea of art as superabundance. Because when we're just sort of cognitively, when we're identifying problems, we're taking an instrumental stance, right? We're trying to think about how to solve something, to fix something, even if the goal of the art itself is not to accomplish a change. Even just the very idea of consciousness raising has I think an inherently kind of utilitarian cast to it. And I'm just wondering about, we haven't talked a lot about art as in its role as just as celebrating what is good, or reveling in art and form for its own sake, like Eliot fiddling with words and rhythms, but doing so because he knows the rhythms, he knows the meters that are standard for English verse, and he can play with them for their own sake because it's fun. And I over this past year of pandemic, I've come to see that as one of the most like liberating and radical actions that you can take is to kind of, especially for those of us who are college educated and professionals, I think we've gone through a lot of training that pushes us towards always being thinking about problems. And to step back from that and to just celebrate what's in what God has created is a way of breaking out of that lattice work of causes and effects and manipulations and utilitarian ideas. So I don't know, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that, Dr. Chaplin.
Well, I agree. There's time for celebration, and I applaud all that art. I think it actually comes together in Ai Weiwei. I think his product, ironically, is an object of immense beauty, and that's why I mentioned also his time in New York when he was actually in the modernist period, where there was all attention on form. I mean, Donald Judd and all the minimalists, as it were, where there was too little content almost, but all the attention was on how to shape and forms and colors and manipulate in a positive sense. I think his final product is exactly doing that. It's a piece of extreme beauty. So in a way, it's redemptive. And so all these broken rods, which were at the cause of all that havoc and destruction, he is meticulously straightened, almost like straighten the path of the Lord. And in that process, almost that prayerful, meditative, kind of long and dark tunnel, out of it came this piece of beauty, which in itself, to me, gives joy. I mean, it shows to me an Easter moment after the Good Friday, the final object. So this is what I find so remarkable in his work. And also, I mean, a lot of work is actually very playful of his, the bikes, there are lots of very funny examples. I mean, it's extremely playful. This is more sober, more minimalist, but the wave, I mean, the bars together, I mean, and also to show even the beauty of rebar is, I mean, it's genius. I mean, something you would never give a second glance when it was lying in the rubble. And he lifts it out like those sunflower seeds. He lifts it out of the rubble, looks at it, straightens it, and all of a sudden it becomes an object of beauty, of aesthetic contemplation. You start to see the beauty of the rust, of the changing colors, the naturalness in a way of the material. Ironically, I mean, the aging process. So all that comes to your attention, and you begin to see the beauty in it, and then collectively as well. And the way he put the waves together, which are also an echo to the waves of the earthquake itself, so this symbolic moment. But it really is a very beautiful piece of sculpture when you walk around it.
Well, we're going to give as much opportunity for people to keep asking questions and interacting after this for a while, but we want to respect the formal time. We have two things that we want to do, but first of all, Dr. Chaplin, do you have any concluding remarks just to wrap up our time, and then we'll, as I say, we'll be back with the opportunity for anyone that likes to stick around and ask comments for as long as you'd like. But Dr. Chaplin?
Just very few. I hope that today may have been a kind of encouragement both to those who are practicing artists and those who aren't, so that those who aren't have realized how much they actually well, both can rely and appreciate the art, even though they think perhaps they are not, and what it has meant to them, especially in this time of crisis when there was so little else to do, but that it may have been a rediscovery, perhaps, of the arts, and for practicing artists, that I meet so many artists who have self-doubt about the value of their work, especially many Christian artists, because it does seem at times rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So I mean, in these times of these huge questions, to refine your craft and your skill and your work may seem kind of just so out of touch with making a direct impact. And I think artists like Ai Weiwei are kind of encouragements to us to say, well, you can spend 3 years straightening bars and something very profound comes out of it, and the process of that is equally important as the final product. So yeah, so that it may be encouragement to just be faithful, keep at it, as it were, and something beautiful will emerge. Let me just leave it at that.
Lovely. Thanks so much. It's one of our traditions within Boston Fellows that we like to ask God's favor on those people who have favored us with insights during our time together. And so, Paula, would you care to pray? We've got one more video we want to show after this that has been recommended to us by Dr. Chaplin, but that's kind of an outro, if you will. But Paula, would you ask God's blessing on Adrienne Dengerink Chaplin?
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together today. We thank you for the zeal with which Dr. Chaplin approaches her faith and the aesthetics in our world today. It has been a tremendous gift to have her join us across the Atlantic to the shores of Boston Harbor, right into our living rooms. We thank you for her conviction that you indeed sprinkle the hope of restoration, the hope of a better world, the hope of your very presence through us and the work of our hands as artists in the arts, as creative thinkers in fields of science and medicine, as innovative problem solvers in finance and engineering. As T.S. Eliot said, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed and the gift half understood is incarnation. Now, as we end our time together and soon part, we ask, Lord, that your hand of favor would rest on Dr. Chaplin and her family. May the inspiration of your Holy Spirit continue to emanate through her work as a writer and a speaker and a curator. And as she further seeks ways of gathering people around the arts to speak about the truth and the justice and the hope that you have in mind with which to someday draw all of creation back to yourself. And we pray this in the name of our Creator God and his risen Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. We're going to continue on, folks, but we have one last treat for you. Dr. Chaplin has suggested a setting of Psalm 129, and I don't know how to explain this. It's according to the YouTube video itself, an 1806 hymn by Isaac Watts meets hip hop, meets Johnny Cash, meets folk, meets New Orleans jazz, meets industrial steel factory, and it's extremely appropriate. So what we want to do, I put it in the chat because the sound quality is not great if you try to do it over Zoom. So here's what we'd like to do. If you wouldn't mind clicking that yourself so that you can listen to that on your own local device. And then once that's through, we'll be back for more questions and interactions with Dr. Chaplin. But don't miss this; it's really a lot of fun and fun. And so we'll see it in just a minute after you've had a chance to listen to that yourself. Friends, we're back. So I don't know how, Dr. Chaplin, I don't know how you found something that incorporated everything we talked about today, just about in one video that was only published like 2 weeks ago or something. That was just remarkable. So fun. Yeah, but guys, there's been several questions that we've had that we weren't able to answer. So if you wouldn't mind going back and reposting any questions you have, or you can just raise your hand and we'll let you interact directly here. Want to give anybody that wants to keep involved an opportunity to say something. Go ahead and just raise your hand. While you're thinking, I want to make an observation myself that that kind of ties with something that of the extravagance of Weiwei's art and art in general. In the Gospels, a woman breaks open a carved alabaster flask of perfume just to pour it over the feet of Jesus. It's an extravagant and an extraordinarily expensive gesture if you look at the cost involved, and it has no utilitarian value at all. In fact, in the context of the story, its value stands in direct defiance of social utility, but Dr. Chaplin, Jesus calls it a beautiful work. The Greek is kalan ergon. What do you make of that? We haven't drawn an explicit connection to the gospel yet. What can we understand about that, please?
Sorry, Kelly.
Just
can you repeat the question?
Yeah, when the woman pours the broken alabaster flask of perfume over Jesus' feet, and we know that Judas was stealing. The scripture tells us that Judas was stealing, and so he and others though criticize her for the waste of it, really, when specifically it could have been given to the poor. And yet Jesus says that that's a beautiful act. He refuses to criticize the excess, the expense. I would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the Greek kalon is often kalagoton, that it's beautiful and good together, isn't it? It's I don't think it's meant in an aesthetic sense as such, although with Ai Weiwei we could actually make a link. Perhaps that's what you were hinting at. You could say it's beautiful because the woman understands the significance of the moment. So she, which is a liturgical moment almost, in the sense that she knows Christ will not be on earth for very long. This is your last chance to express something extravagant, as you said, something out of the ordinary, which normally, would be more in functional terms. I mean, there's always this kind of tension between what we do for the poor and what seems extravagant. And Jesus' answer was, of course, you will always have the poor with you. And also it's not either or necessarily. I mean, if you can afford well, not necessarily in this case, but I mean, we can be extravagant and we can be generous and charitable. It's not necessarily that it's not a zero-sum game that you can't do the one without the other. yeah, I'm not. What do you think yourself?
Well, it's so part of why it's so poignant to me is
Yeah.
just had COVID and I still can't smell.
Whoa. Yeah.
And it's a gesture of
Yeah.
that odor of smelling that I mean it has a function in burial, but mostly that function is to mask the smell of death. And but I can't really smell either one most of the time, but the whole point of it is precisely that, I guess. I can't really articulate all that I'm thinking there, but
But yeah, what is lovely about it as well is that it is smell. We so often think in terms of beauty in visual terms, more detached. The same the way that we sometimes talk about the beauty of God, which I think raises some questions if it is kind of detached contemplation, like you have 18th century aesthetics. I mean, the presence of God is often much more holistic. It's not just visual. In fact, what is it visual? You could say, but what do we see? I mean, God is invisible. I mean, often we talk in terms of light or something, but that is very almost presented to us, those words that we have to see God. I mean, in reality, I don't see God as light in a mental image. I mean, the presence of God is much more in terms of well, His Spirit in us, which is more like smell almost, or touch. Or I mean, some people even talk in terms of temperature. Huh? They feel a warmth coming over them if they have experiences of the Holy Spirit. They feel physically all of a sudden warm, which is a very different sense than kind of detached gazing at something, which is much more objectifying almost. So the Hebrew sensibilities were also much more multi-central than, say, the Greek notions. The Greek were very optically kind of focused. Everything was about seeing, and which is a very intellectual sense as well. So you say, "Oh, now I see it. Now I understand it," as it were. You wouldn't say, "Oh, now I smell it." But the Hebrews, they had also much more appreciation for, say, natural beauty, the gemstones, or so when they describe beauty, it's often in multi-central language. Therefore, it fits in that framework of all the senses, and also it doesn't make a distinction between the higher and the lower senses, which is very 18th century, where sensing, about seeing, and sometimes hearing, but it is almost always seeing. Is kind of is a mental faculty, whereas smelling, touching, and what's the other one? Tasting.
Right.
Yeah, they are the so-called bodily senses, which are more kind of animal sense. I don't think that that's the case necessarily. I think they're much more holistic and also often and much more synesthetic. They're much work together much more, I think, than we sometimes realize. I mean, even looking at paintings, you hear sometimes the atmosphere. If it's a very quiet landscape, the sounds implicitly also impinge on you, and sometimes even smells. In fact, Cézanne has a direct quote where he says, "I want to paint the smell of the landscape." So and so I think a lot of painters would get that. in phenomenological theory, you have much more attention to an integrated sense of all the senses. So he said, when you look at the crystal of a glass, you almost subconsciously hear it tinkle or sparkle, or so that comes with the visual appreciation, because we engage with this object. It's not just a two-dimensional picture.
Right.
So that smell is important, and I hope you do get it back soon, Kelly. That's
yeah. I mean, I have once in a while I think I'm smelling something, but it's never quite certain. And yeah, and worship. You know, it's not very often that I get a chance to to experience incense in worship, as some of our high church Anglicans do in the circles I run in. But it's a really important, to me. It's the smoke that you can see rising as prayers, but also that, you know, there's many instances in which the sacrifices in the Old Testament, the anointing of the feet of Jesus, and so many others in which smell is a part of worship. Yeah. So Heather, you have a question, go ahead.
Oh, hold on. Sorry. I just wanted to make a comment that I really appreciated thinking about art in a different way. I've never thought about it in terms of justice. I've always thought about it in terms of beauty and aesthetic, and just loving the, just kind of delving into it and sort of as an escape, and the beauty of it. So thank you for a new way to think about it. I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
Your chair is specifically theological aesthetics, and I want to make the connection again with worship. I think that worship is fundamentally an aesthetic act. It's witnessing and expressing something of the beauty of our God. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What connections do you make in your own thinking and in your teaching between aesthetics and worship? I mean, another one of those really simple questions for you.
It's not a focus of my work, I have to admit.
Okay.
Yeah. I totally agree. There's an aesthetic dimension to worship, a very fundamental one and an often overlooked one. And we already touched upon that with the incense. Even how we arrange the chairs. I mean, whether it's straight in the pews in a row, or chairs in a semicircle, or I mean, or even the lighting. Is it spotlights from above, or is it a more gentle, obscure candlelight or something? These things are hugely important. If I would call it fundamentally an aesthetic act, I'm not sure. But if it is, if you mean it in the way I just articulated it, I would agree. So yeah, worship is, again, as everything else, multi-essential, and something we so much overlook in our Protestant worship. So that if it is a bare church hall, and we're almost encouraged to think that it is unspiritual to think about it, and that sit there almost and blocking all our senses, and it's the word of God.
Right.
So, well, that raises the role of images, of course. And
yes, well, I was going to ask about that. I mean, you know, coming from Protestant background, that there's a very ambivalent relationship with art, valuing it sometimes, certainly in some pieces, some aspects of the Reformation, but then iconoclasm, which literally means destroying religious images. how do you, you're from a very reformed background, and I know your commitments, but specifically on that question, how do you engage with that?
Yeah, no, I live near Ely Cathedral, and there are many helpless statues in there, or empty niches where there used to be statues, or destroyed frescoes. I'm very aware of it. One thing to keep in mind is that in almost all iconoclastic movements, whether in England or in Zurich or in France, there was a strong political element, that all these images were seen as symbols of the old regime, which needed to be overturned. I mean, that was even the case in the French Revolution, which had nothing to do with theology. So the plundering of and destruction of the artwork in the monasteries was purely political. And ironically, the Louvre was founded on some people said, well, but why destroy all these things, and why don't we collect them, rather than have them the property of the church? We make them the property of the people. So the Louvre was founded as the first presentation of the national heritage, which included religious art. And it was out of its cultic context and set, and this was the beginning of art meant for aesthetic contemplation. So then you start looking at art purely for its formal and beauty qualities, and you completely forget that, of course, it came out of a church and it was used as an altarpiece. So
that seems to be the case in France specifically, where Notre Dame, for example, where there was the fire recently, it belongs to the state, and there's an enormous amount of desire to reconstruct it there, and yet France is 90-some% atheist. Some people have said, something, the French are 95% Catholic, but almost 100% atheist, or something like. I think I've gotten there, but the specifically religious, and yet there's an appreciation.
Yeah, so of course there's a strong underlying theology as well against images based on Exodus, and Calvin writes very eloquently about that in the Institutes, in his first book, chapter 11, well, and some of the things I think are worth listening to. And one of the things is that God cannot be captured in a 6-foot image or statue, and in a way that parallels the apophatic theology, where people say the same about language. God cannot be captured in any language or concept or noun. So we should stay clear of any articulation of God. He is so other that that neither words nor images are sufficient for him. And the Jewish notion of not even speaking the name of God is another. So it fits in that sensibility, and perhaps we are too flippant about that. And now he talks about God. I mean, image of Christ, of course, the incarnation is very different.
Paul says that in Colossians that Christ is the image of the invisible God, which is a brain-twisting expression.
Yeah, the icon of God. Yeah. Now, I think Calvin is wrong with his interpretation of the second command, because it was not a ban on images as such, but specifically images which were used as idols. And the Hebrew word pesal, which is used for graven image, or which is translated as graven image, usually referred not so much to 2-dimensional images, but to 3-dimensional images. So it was statues, and they could be small and carried along, or large, like when David escaped, and was it Abigail who used the statue in a bed to deceive the people. They were so the new translations actually don't use the word graven image anymore. They translate it directly as idol, making precisely that point. So not even the ban on images, but it's the ban on idols. And that makes sense with the preceding passage and the one which is afterwards, which Calvin himself, actually, he changed the order of those verses and made it a separate command, thou shalt not make any graven image. The verse before is, thou shalt not make any idols.
Which is why there's a different way of counting the commandments, what counts as, which are which, and between, say, Calvinism and Lutheranism and Catholicism. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and then he also underestimated that we always do, that words have the same effect as mental images. I think the Bible uses so many images for God and Jesus, which are often opposites, as like king and servant, or lamb and shepherd. And I think it makes precisely that point. It's not just a lamb, he's not just a shepherd, he's not just a king. It has all those dimensions, and that is the key of metaphor in language, that we describe a dimension of him. We never can capture God in one word. And so it always has multiple images.
And all of language is metaphor. There's no escaping metaphor. There's no way of even speaking that doesn't include metaphor at some point.
Yeah, and I think Calvin underestimated that his own language was already making mental images of God. I mean, one consequence of that for images in church is that perhaps we have to rotate images. So rather than having one altarpiece for a whole generation, that people see only one image of Christ, be it the triumphant creator or the suffering servant on the cross, or that we have to, like we rotate the garments in the liturgical seasons, that also representations of God have a fluidity, that we are not fixated on one visual representation or one visual word. So rather than banning images, we might say, well, more, but don't attach too much kind of exclusive value to them, as if that is the one which is. So, for example, the Warner Solomon image of the head of Christ, which was so popular in Protestant evangelical visual piety, which became the iconic kind of representation of Christ, to the point that they said, well, this is how I picture Christ, and not realizing that of course the culture already formed, although that was in a way a combination of a lot of different paintings in the past of Christ. And so here's the beard, the long hair, the blue eyes. So
completely not too often represented as white, when there's no way he possibly could have been had some of the features there, but we all go ahead.
But well, just to make the point that people would say that's Christ, as it were, almost without doubt, and but also gained a lot of comfort from it, and felt it a very helpful aid to pray to, and so on. So I'm not denigrating it, but I think a multiplicity of images is more healthy for a healthy devotional life.
Yeah, you're so right that what we know of God in Scripture is a study in contrast, the huge and great, and the still and the small, and Well, friends, you're not asking questions, but you're sticking around, so I think we'll follow the principle that you always leave them wanting more, and and finish there. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, Dr. Chaplin. It's wonderful and rich. Next month, folks, we're going to have a teaching Saturday on science and faith, and I see Chris Sachsenmeyer here, and maybe others from the STEM cohort. So that's our next look together. But thank you so much, and we'll leave it there. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you here another time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.